This next slide is a little bit of a review, in that we've already talked about essentialism and constructionism. I want to refer back to the Thomas theorem now, the idea that things that we define as real become real in their consequences. So when we are referring to social phenomenon as being socially constructed, I'm not trying to undermine the idea that things are real, because the consequences of the situation are as real as can be. But the idea is that the difference was socially constructed. If you treat someone as inferior, even if they never were inferior in the first place, the outcome is that they feel inferior, and the rest of society treats them as such, so they become, from the social standpoint, inferior. Essentialism believes that the boundaries that divide people into different race, sex, class, and sexual orientation groups are obvious and reflect who people truly are. A person is a female, is a Native American, is a heterosexual, is middle class. This way of thinking, known as essentialism, focuses on what are believed to be universal, inherent, and unambiguous essences that distinguish one group from another. It doesn't matter what people call these categories or how they react to them. The categories have a concrete truth that exists independently of people's judgments or definitions. From the essentialist perspective, people's definitions and labels can change, but an individual's essence always exists. An alternative to essentialism is constructionism, also known as the social construction of reality perspective, which argues that what we know to be real and essential is always a product of the culture and historical period in which we live. Categorical distinctions based on race, class, gender, and sexuality are human creations and don't exist independently of our ideas about them and responses to them. We may be quite sure that an objective reality independent of us exists out there, but constructionists argue that what we believe to be real, and what we call that reality, is always a matter of human definition and collective agreement. In other words, is a reality that is socially constructed. What is important to link is the idea of identifiers, and that we categorize people according to characteristics linked to those identifiers. And then we create social reality that's framed using those identifiers. And Newman has a few other points about how these identifiers work, that they depend on context, that they tend to make us think in terms of opposites or using dichotomies, and they reflect social rankings and power relations. And one other important aspect that ties into the social construction of reality is that those identifiers tend to have both psychological and structural meanings. I think that Cornell and Hartman's quote helps to drive home the idea of essentialism and how differences of characteristics then become used to drive the social order. They state, "We decide that particular physical traits will be the primary markers of boundaries between groups. We invent these categories and they become socially significant to the extent that they're used to organize experiences, to form social relations, to evaluate others, and to determine social rankings and access to important resources." I particularly like this quote because it looks at how both the essentialist process and the social constructionist process work together. We might think that one or the other dominates how we come to understand the social order and how it works, but they really work together to some extent. We create the categories based on identifiable characteristics, and then we create a social order that's patterned along the system that the essentialist way of ordering and patterning our social world was first created.